Joao está. Olá, muitas boas noites. Bem-vindos a todos. Welcome you all. Que língua é que vamos utilizar? Com Ingman, Pouman, Chongman, Ingman, Hodi. Okay, we're gonna do it in English, but whenever we feel like we're gonna shift to Portuguese if necessary for some expressions, so that will be, I think, helpful. Portanto, bem-vindo a todos. Welcome. First of all, I'd like to give you a bit of background on this panel. It all started when me and Elder, we were talking, when was like over a year ago, about having something on press history. And then together, me on behalf of the Macau Portuguese and English Press Association, Associação de Imprensa em Português e Inglês de Macau. And we thought, well, me and Elder, who else would be better than our very own top experts on press history, Agnes Lam and Joao Guedes. So I'd like to thank you very much, Elder, Ricardo, and the Script Road Festival for all that's been achieved over the years, and for coupling and putting together and looking at literature in a holistic way, multifaceted, and we look at journalism as the first draft of history, so, and somehow, and also to a great extent, of literature. And if we look at newspapers, how they used to be, especially back in the day, in the 19th century, it was a bit of that. It was a different concept, but it is very, very interesting. So here we are today, and at the end of the day, this is like old friends getting together. And in the case of Agnes and Joao, well, they did work together back in the 1990s and even in the early 21st century. Then I arrived in Macau 15 years ago, and I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity of working directly with Joao Guedes, and also contributing and going to conferences together with Agnes. I guess most of you are familiar with the resume of Agnes Lam and Joao Guedes, but I'd like, summing up, Agnes Lam is a professor of journalism at the University of Macau, Department of Communication, head of the Macau Studies, Center for Macau Studies, author, also a writer, a former journalist, what I believe it's like once a journalist, always a journalist, so you are in your heart still a journalist, of course, and she's now widely known for being a member of the Macau SCR Legislative Assembly. But the reason why Agnes is here, because she has been conducting a number of research, and she's been deeply involved in research projects, very, very valuable on the history of Macau's press, focusing mostly on the 19th century. You got the book, okay. Okay, so this should be, Agnes, help me here, 中国 whatever, sorry.
So it's the beginning of the Chinese press and also the Macau press history. So
Exactly.
Actually the Chinese modern press history began in Macau. So
right.
Yeah, okay.
So this is really great stuff, because your PhD dissertation is basically about this, and this is like building on that, what you've done in your scholarly work, and this is for a wider audience. And then we got someone who's been conducting pioneer research on the history of Macau's press, mostly focused on Chinese, but not only Chinese language, also Portuguese and English language. And there we have Joao Guedes. What can I say? You arrived in Macau 3 months before I was born, so that's... Sorry, I didn't mean to say that you're kind of old and I'm still young. Oh, that was 37 years ago, almost 38. He was very young back then. He was 5 years old. So, yeah. Anyway, Joao Guedes has been based in Macau since 1980. if I call you a veteran journalist, you don't mind the word, if me using the word veteran, because they're highly respectable. Well, we worked at TDM and he's still a contributor at TDM. Most recently, many of you are familiar with his work in documentaries on focusing on the history of Macau, and also author of a number of books, of volumes, articles, with a keen interest on the history of Macau's press. And I would stop because when I start, I go on, and then I steal the limelight. That's not right. Anyway, they have this common shared interest on Macau's history, the history of Macau's press, and we are going to delve into what happened back in the early 19th century. Let's go back in time, 200 years ago. Agnes, in 1818, there was, oh yes, 1818, yes. Probably an auspicious year, I believe, but was there any newspaper in Macau back then?
So actually, we can't really confirm that if in 1818 we had any newspaper. So now everyone believes that the first newspaper in Macau was published in 1822. It's Barrier de China. But then what I try to find is that because we read those kind of diary from the priest, and then we find that there might be some other format of news earlier than 1822. And actually in this book, which I promise I have it translated in English already, so I'm doing the proofread. I hope I can publish it this year. And so then what I found is that in 1817, the latest in say 1817, there was a priest. And so he worked in the Jesuit Academy Seminary here. And so he's been doing a lot of news writing. And so he wrote something that he named it as Diario Noticias. That means my Portuguese is muito mal, okay? So it's like daily news, that means literally.
Diário de Notícias.
Yeah, daily news. So, and then at least there was some form of journalism, some form of news there, because he wrote daily news every day. And so that's why he recorded a lot of events that were happening in those years from 1817 to 1835. So it was at least like 15 years he was writing that. And so then we didn't know what format of those news were, because that what we know now is that later Father Manuel Teixeira, he found those material before they were destroyed, and then he transcribed them to another form of publication and publishing by the church later in 1970s. So if you read those kind of material now, you know that that father, the name is Joaquin Layton. And so Joaquin Layton, he wrote it like, okay, so today something happened in mainland China, in Guangzhou, okay, there was a fire. So he wrote something like that. And so there was a ship coming from Macau, from Japan to Macau. So he basically wrote things happening every day, and even things happening inside the seminarium. Okay, so he just did that. So clearly it was a form of news. There was the event, key figures, and then he wrote it. But now, we didn't know it was some kind of report, or he wrote it in a booklet, or they published it inside the cemetery or anything. We just don't know. And in the church, we don't know. But then the news itself is kind of, we can still read it. You can still read it nowadays. So I believe that there were some kind of, some format of news earlier than Abaya de China. But we still don't know what that would be. And also, if we want to kind of really go back to the history, even in the 16th century, the Jesuit priests, and they've been printing booklets and also kind of pamphlet in Macau and also in Chongqing. And so I found it in the Jesuit archive in Rome, and then I found all those booklets that they published. And then they were publishing booklet in Chinese and also publishing booklet in Latin. And so they published some form of dictionary, okay, in Latin and Chinese. And so they were using the woodblock printing in Macau at that time. Even that they bought the first modern printing machine were bought by the Jesuit, okay, and then that's Joao, and then he brought it here. But they didn't really use it to print anything in Macau, and then maybe some of you know that story already. But then instead, when people like Matthew Ritchie and Michel Houdini, when they were in Macau, and then what they wrote in their diary were like that. Okay, so the paper is much cheaper here in Macau, in China, and so then they also have a kind of easy, printing machine, and so then they decided to print in Chinese and using the woodblock printing. So they were doing that. So then, but then, if you read those kind of pamphlets that they published in 16th century, it was all missionary content. So there was no news. So the first kind of news publication would be maybe Joaquin later did it, but then the only seen newspaper format only happened when Abel de China published. So that's what my discovery, yeah.
And thinking on that, Abelha da China, João, we look at that as the first newspaper periodical in the format of something that resembles really a newspaper, right, of Macau. 1822, right?
Well, Abelha da China was the first, one of the first newspapers, because there are more newspapers before the English newspapers. Before
the Canton registered during the Canton trade system.
No, actually, after Abelha da China, and then there was the second one called Macau Gazette, and Orange, and then there was one named Ugu Majao, and then there was another 2 or 3, and then we start to have the English, yeah. So actually, there were quite some Portuguese newspaper at that time, yeah.
It is interesting to talk about this, the beginnings of the newspapers in Macau, about these English newspapers. Macau always have two faces. Nothing is very real in Macau, always.
Janus-faced, right?
And these English newspapers normally, they say in the first page that they are printing in Canton. Well, they are not printing in Canton. They were printing in Macau, but they cannot say that they are printed in Macau, because the press is not allowed in Macau. So the governor closed the eyes and let it pass. And this is the after that it appears the Abelha da China, because before it is forbidden to publish anything in Macau. The only place where it's possible to print something is in Goa. That is the capital of the Far East Portuguese places. Is the capital of Macau, Timor, Solar, Flores, these colonies, Portuguese colonies around. And in a late period before the liberal revolution, the Kingdom of Portugal allowed the Goa to publish things, not newspapers, Bibles and these things, because the Inquisition is settled in Goa, so it's easy to control. But otherwise, nothing can be printed outside Lisbon. But in this area, you can say that the first Portuguese newspaper published after the liberal law of 1820, the first constitution in Portugal, was one newspaper that I don't remember the name, in Mozambique. This was the first Portuguese newspaper outside
mainland Portugal.
Before even than Goa. Goa is the second place, and after that it appeared.
And interestingly and incidentally, Abelha da China was relatively short-lived, didn't last long, and it was marked by controversy, right? It was a controversial newspaper. Why is that?
Yes, very, very controversial because the Abelha da China was everything but not neutral. Is against the old regime, but it adds the politics, Portugal politics. It adds the local politics. So there are two parties: one party of the old authorities and another party of the new authorities. New authorities are around the Abelha da China, and the old ones, that was the ouvidor, the governor also, and a few more people are against. And because of that, the Abelha da China was the journal of the propaganda of the liberals. It's interesting to say that there was no printing press here in Macau and before, and the one very big merchant that is the monopolist of the tobacco in Portugal is a man from Brazil, Bahia, Gonçalves Serva, took a printing press, put the printing press in one of these ships because he owns lots of ships. He's also a big merchant here in Macau, and he put the printing press inside one of these ships and came to Macau with it to make Abelha da China. So I think there was a political plan that is designed around Abelha da China. It's not a journal to give the news about Macau. I think it's, and in my opinion, for now I have no facts, but I think with this Gonçalves Serva, there were also another one, Baiano, from Bahia, in Brazil, that is the Lieutenant Cavalcanti, is the great-great-grandfather of the singer
Francisco Buarque de Holanda?
Yes,
I know this story. Chico Buarque.
Yes. Another one was the Lieutenant Colonel Paulino Barbosa, also another Baiano. They were all at the same time here in Macau. They start the Abelha da China. They aroused the people of Macau against the old authorities. Macau cut his ties with Goa and became a de facto independent place during 1 year. So I'm convinced that this plan has something to do with the independence of Brazil. Yes. I have to say that Coronel Paulino Barbosa is also a professor of mathematics in Coimbra, and Cavalcanti was also a professor in Coimbra, and they were the professors of the Nautic School of Macau that was at that time very, very important, and it lost ground. I don't know why, but after the absolutists, the anti-constitutionalists came to Macau, and they put again the old order in Macau. They destruct completely the Nautic School of Macau. I think because political thinking. So I think this plan is connected with the independence of Brazil. Maybe I'm wrong, but
could be a book called The Bahia Coimbra Macau Conspiracy, or
yes,
something like that.
Could be that.
Bahia, which is Bay, the Greater Bay Conspiracy. No, that would be something else. So we're talking about journalism or newspapers in the intersection of power and history and politics. And Agnes, well, we're talking about the role played by the church, by the Jesuits, not only the Catholic Church, but also Protestant missionaries, one in particular, right?
Actually, I just want to refer to
Sure, sure,
something Joao just said. And like about the China, so in all the Chinese textbook, they mention it is the earliest one, this is the first one. But they always say that, okay, that was not a very important newspaper for the Chinese community because they only focus on the internal politics of in Portugal, something like that. But then when we read it, and then I found that newspaper was very important. And because in the Chinese press, it was until almost like the beginning of 20th century, we start to read the term of Macanese or Omoyan or Macau people. It didn't happen in 19th century and early 20th century. But then, Abaya de China, if you remember that in their editorial, the first editorial, they used the term of Macanese already. So they were basically using that around the people in Macau. So they were using the Macanese, please stand up for yourself, for your rights, something like that. It was something like that. So actually, I find it very interesting is that, so what I believe is that who invent the concept of Omoyan or Macanese or Macau people, who invent the concept. So if you read the newspaper, you will find that what I can find out, maybe because some of you may find it from some other text, but if we are talking about press, okay, newspaper, and so one material that everyone can read, it was about the China, and so they invented the term of Macanese. And later that term was kind of translated by the Echo Macayans. Because Echo Macayans is the bilingual newspaper, Chinese language one. You might know that it was associated with Shen Yashen. And so then when they wrote story at Macau, they started to refer to people in Macau as kind of Omoyan. But then it stopped. And then later we have a Chinese press that they didn't use that. And then until like 20th century, like 30 years or 40 years, and then they start to call people in Macau as Omoyan, Macau, mechanism. So that term was kind of really I think, brought up or event by the mechanists and starting from about the China, and that's one thing, yeah. And so then because when we go back to the missionary, it's basically the London church when they came here. So there was another big important person, Robert Morrison, and so what I discovered is that actually he published the first Chinese newspaper in Macau, and it's in my book. And it was very important also in the Chinese history. It's like this. So it was like before this one, this is called Zhao Wenpian. So he published several newspapers in Macau. This is Chinese one.
Zhao Wenpian.
Zhao Wenpian. Zhao Wenpian. It means missionary. Okay, miscellaneous. Sorry, miscellaneous. And so he published this one, and he also published a bilingual newspaper, and he published an English newspaper, and so he published 3. And then, but if you read that, it's very different from Abaya de China. It's a missionary newspaper. It's basically talking about how, okay, was the God, the world, who invented the world, things like that. But then in this Chinese one, all of Robert Morrison's kind of newspaper, he would publish a little bit of news. But if you compare to the Portuguese newspaper that were published at the same time, the Portuguese newspaper, even that we say that they were very political, but then they have a lot more news. You know what I mean? And then maybe like sometimes it's one page, one whole pages. And then if they publish 4 pages, there will be at least 1 page is full of news, Portuguese press. But then in all those Robert Morrison's publication, it would be only like half pages or just 1 column. It was news. So it was very different, yeah.
Echo Macans this is a fascinating story, right?
Yeah.
Because as far as I understand, and correct me here if I'm wrong, well, the Chinese content was not exactly a translation of the Portuguese content, right?
It wasn't. And so I can't really tell because I didn't read every story, but then the Chinese content was very, it didn't seem like intellectual were writing it. They use some very kind of slang language, and then they criticize the government a lot at the time. So that's why you know that newspaper was banned literally later. And so, but then the way that it was really a Macau newspaper, because you know that we even though we speak in Chinese, we are from Macau, we speak Cantonese. And so the Cantonese way, the way that we write would be different from the mainlander. And so, but then the Echo Macayen's, the style that it was written was basically Cantonese. So it was dialect Chinese. And it was very interesting. It's kind of ancient Chinese, you know, together with some Cantonese dialects. So it's very, very different from the newspaper published, you know, during the same time in China or in Hong Kong at that time. And so it was a very unique one, yeah.
And still talking about, thank you, Agnes, still talking about Eco Macaense, João Guedes. We have to talk about the relationship between Francisco Fernandes and Sun Yat-sen.
Well, Eco Macaense is very, very interesting and very peculiar because
Francisco
Agnes,
Fernandes was the owner, the publisher, local Macanese lawyer.
No, he was not a lawyer.
Well, that's wrong. Lawyer is the...
lawyer is Joaquim Basto.
Yes,
that
sorry,
is the
sorry.
lawyer of Sun Yat-sen, and is also near of the journal, but was not a lawyer. He's a journalist. The Eco Macaense have one peculiarity. Is for me is the only maybe there are more, but I don't know, really Chinese and Portuguese newspaper, because everyone in the newsroom speaks Chinese. So there are an integration that we cannot see, not before nor after. Only in the 20th century, in a newspaper called Tai Chung Po, that
yes.
still exists, yes, but it's not the same. It's very different from this Eco Macaense. But at that time of Eco Macaense, the Portuguese press, the Chinese press is very vibrant. Politics everywhere. And there are one interesting thing. At that moment, Sun Yat-sen was not a Republican that we think is a Republican. No, he's between different currents. And at that time, he's very connected with the anarchists in Macau. Namely Liu Sifu, that was the theoretical guy of the anarchism in China. And they publish a little bit later the first newspaper in Esperanto was published in Macau, the first newspaper of all the Far East in Esperanto. So is these guys, Francisco Fernandes, Sun Yat-sen, Liu Sifu, and the other guys that make schools in Macau, Leung Kai-chiu,
Leung Kai-chiu, yeah, Leung Kai-chiu. So they were Leung Kai-chiu was the what we call is the evolutionists in China. So then it was that they were those kind of elite in mainland China, and so then they start all those evolution earlier than Sun Yat-sen. And so actually they were also active in Macau, and then they published their newspaper named Jixinbao. Jixinbao, yeah, so it's Jixinbao. But one thing I want to confirm with Joao, because I don't know if the Eco Macaense holds kind of very highly critical view of the Guedes Hospital, because then one thing, because in China, Chinese community always kind of curious about how Sun Yat-sen is involved in the Eco Macaense. We just thought that they were friends. It looks like that he wrote something for Eco Macaense, but his name was never there except the advertisement for his pharmacy, Sun Yat-sen's pharmacy. Zhongsai Yuegok. So it's, and then, but I found there were several articles very interesting. because they literally criticized the Gangwoo hospital in a way saying that this hospital is so bad that you can only get a bed there when you have money or if, when you're very well connected. It's more or less the same
Yes,
same thing now. Okay, so
It kind of sounds,
so the
yeah,
same
sounds
kind of
familiar.
criticism. It seems that was very interesting, but it was really looked like that someone so familiar with the internal politics of Gangwoo Hospital. And so then if you read it, it looks like, okay, Sun Yat-sen wrote that piece. But there was no name, so it was not his name. We didn't know. But I don't know if they have the same kind of article about the Gangwoo Hospital in the Portuguese version.
Yes, because at that time, Mr. António Joaquim Bastos, that you spoke, was the lawyer of Sun Yat-sen. And he defends Sun Yat-sen in various cases in the pages of the newspaper. And he's against a certain current inside the Gangwoo. That is the responsible for the expulsion of Sun Yat-sen from Macau, because the Chinese doctors, not all, apart, don't like to have and they make pressure with the governor to expel Sun Yat-sen because he have no diploma from the University of Coimbra. And António Joaquim Basto, that writes also in the Echo Macaense, have a very vivid polemics about Sun Yat-sen and the position of the Gangwoo Hospital doctors.
Oh, so it's identical actually. So because I don't know. I only read the Chinese version and then only the Portuguese advertisement related to Sun Yat-sen. Yeah. Okay, that's good to know. Yeah.
Because I think the connection between Sun Yat-sen and António Joaquim Basto in terms of journalism is unofficial. They don't want to be seen as very close because the Portuguese government cannot be accused of be partial with Sun Yat-sen because the politics of China.
So we reach the end of the 19th century. What is the picture in terms of newspapers? You said it was pretty vibrant, highly critical, plenty of politics. How would you, I mean, when you look at those newspapers, what's the kind of feeling that you've got?
Well, I think after the Echo Macaense, that is really a case study, and there are lots to study about the Echo Macaense and the persons around the Echo Macaense, and this period of the last 10 years of the 19th century is very, very important, and is characterized by polemics about well, there are we have to say that there are here two faces. One is the press of the colonial Portugal at the time, because Macau elects 4 MPs, 2 senators and 2 MPs. So the newspapers of Portugal always have the politicians that want to run with Macau ticket. They write in Portuguese press, and and this politics reflects here in Macau. The other side is the local politics, and the local politics is very important and is interesting, but that sometimes we read the Portuguese newspapers and we cannot understand what they are speaking about, because there are lots of Chinese politics that only the people that are inside can understand what the news, the comments, the editorials, all that things speaks about. And this is very interesting, and it's very interesting to study that and decode all that underground politics that surface in the newspapers of the time.
And Agnes, what about the press in Chinese towards the end of the 19th
The
century?
Chinese one is much more quiet comparing to the Portuguese. The Portuguese, they published like 100, newspaper in 19th century in Macau, like almost like that. There's a lot of titles. But then the Chinese, we only have, what we can see were 3 to see the true newspaper. But if we count some of the names that people mentioned, it was published in Macau, there were only 4. So the first one was the one published by Robert Morrison, the one I said in 1833, 杂文篇. And that one, we only found 3 issues. Okay, so it's 3 issues. And then the second one was Echo Macau's Chinese version. And so that one, it published only like 2 years. And then because it was banned after the chief editor in Chinese, and then he wrote something criticized the government. So the Chinese version was banned, but not the Portuguese one. And so then it was the Jixinbao, the evolutionists from China, and then I don't know if you're familiar with the Chinese history at that time. So it was in the Qing dynasty. So there was one emperor named Guangxi. So he tried to have some, neo-politics to have some to reform China, right? And so then they failed, and those people like Chichao and other elite at that time, and then they fled to Japan, and then eventually they sent someone to Macau and published Jixinbao. And Jixinbao's English name, they have an official Chinese name, is named Reform China. So instead they're trying to reform China in Macau, okay? But there was no news at all about Macau. So they published here for like 2 years, and they never mentioned Macau, except they said that they published in Macau. So it's all about new technology in the Western world, and how can we use them to improve our industry, our agriculture, So it was all stories like that. So they really want to reform China. But so that's another one. And then there was one more. We can't find the newspaper itself, but I read it from time to time. People mention the name is Ho Gangbo. Ho Gangbo. Ho Gangbo is also like Echo Macau. It's kind of similar in Chinese, Ho Gangbo. And that one was also published by the gang of the Reform China. So another person who's stationed in Guangzhou. And then I think they were trying to have some kind of revolution at that time. So they published several similar newspapers in Guangzhou, in Hengshan, in Guangzhou, Hengshan. Hengshan is Zhuhai, literally, and Macau. And so that I think they were trying to do something. I can find one ad they post in another newspaper saying that Ho Gangbo and the other several newspapers, they were sold in certain spots in Guangzhou and Macau, and even San Francisco. So it's kind of, it was kind of, I think it was a time when people like Lang Chichao and then Shen Zhenshan, they were trying to do something together, pre-revolution time. They were trying to do something. But I can't find any true copy of that newspaper. So there will be only 4. And so if you kind of look at this 3 or 4 newspaper, and so you will see that only Echo Macau's, they report about Macau. And I think a lot of reason was that they partly translate the Portuguese version. And so they were really doing it as a newspaper. I think that was the reason. And so for the first Macau newspaper in Chinese that really publishing about Macau is called Owen Tongbo, and it was only published in 1914, the First World War, during that time. So it happened quite late.
Very interesting and fascinating. Here we can see that Macau was in the past a safe haven for refugees, for dissidents, a hotbed for revolutionary activities, a place of freedom and of tolerance. Intolerance by the authorities, but always activists fighting back. I'd like to open the floor. So if you'd like to throw in some questions, remarks, anything, please feel free. Ricardo, obrigado. Thank you. Thank you
One
for
question
everything.
to Agnes regarding Eco Macaense. In fact, if the idea of the Chinese supplement was to hide the identity of Sun Yat-sen, it was quite disingenuous because the Portuguese version, the Portuguese book, the Portuguese newspaper, actually was identifying him. And they were actually translating all his articles. And most of them, in fact, they were about China, about reforming China. And, but there was some texts about Kiangwu Hospital. He was really, angry with them because he was not treating the doctors as doctors. He would call them like merchants of health because he really was...
That was not translated in Chinese, actually.
So, it was... in the Portuguese version, it was very much identified as Sun Yat-sen, maybe 4, 5, 6 weeks, and then all the translations ended up. I am curious about two things. One question is for you, Agnes, is about, you just said that the first Chinese newspaper that was published with news about Macau was in 1914. I was actually about to ask you if, for instance, during the 1910 battle against the pirates in Koloan, what kind of attitude the Chinese press had towards that. Of course, now we see that there was none. But for instance, in the 20s, when there are a lot of strikes, a lot of riots and so on, we know that during the World War II, after the World War II, with Tai Chung Po, Vaiku, and then Omun Yat Po, there was a lot of different positioning with the nationalists and the communist newspapers. How was it in the 20s? And what kind of approach they had in those very, very dramatic strikes and riots and conflicts?
So actually, I think if I remember correctly, the first newspaper that was really pro-communist only published in 1956. The first one. And before that, all the newspapers, they were pro-Kuomintang, pro-nationalist. So they were like that. So even that they have different view, on certain issue, but when there was war, especially the Second World War, and so they were all kind of united together when the war came. And so they have the same will, and then so, of course, they support China at that time, the National Party, Kuomintang's kind of regime, they support them. And so they ask people to, they mobilize people in Macau to help, to conquer, Japan. So we were all anti-Japan at that time. And then they motivate young people from Macau to go back to China and join the army. And they report story like the 19-year-old boy become a pilot in mainland China, and then he died in the war, and then it was all those kind of patriotic propaganda. It was basically like that. So that was the time. But then since 1956, when the first newspaper, actually that was the ancestor of Macau Daily News, when that newspaper was published, and then the newspaper, they start to take side, and so later. Tai Chung Po became pro-communist, and just like that. And one more thing is that during the war, actually, there were 2 newspapers. They were pro-Japan. They were pro-Japan, and so So we, at different time we have I forgot this one. 2 newspapers for Japan. I think they were kind of bought by the Japanese army, something like that. Yeah. But after that, all those kind of the 2 parties politics only arrived Macau in 1950s.
And the question I would like to ask Joao is like for many decades, of course, news from Macau would arrive in Portugal very late, and the other way around the same, because news were brought by ships. That's the way of having news from abroad, right? Actually, for instance, the governor Ferreira do Amaral was supposed to marry with power of attorney, and then when his marriage was celebrated when he was already dead, because the power of attorney arrived in Portugal. No one knew yet about his assassination, and so he was married being dead. That's how things happened in those days. I wonder, when was it that that kind of very, very slow transmission of news ended up? What was the first newspaper that benefited from a different kind, faster way of collecting news, and what was the impact in the local media?
I'm not sure exactly which newspaper. I think the first newspaper to have news from the agencies at that time was Reuters, was the Independent. Independent is in the late 19th century. It starts with a dynasty of journalists. Is José da Silva, the founder of the Independente, and his son Constâncio José da Silva, that will be a very important guy in the politics in Macau. And the news that arrive at that time, it comes with the name. Reuters is in the Jornal Independente, and also in the A Verdade of Constâncio José da Silva in 19th century, in 20th century, and it was through Reuters agency that the Macau people knew that the Portuguese Republic was implanted in Portugal 5 days later, after so very fast if compared with the 2 years before.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Thậm chí kéo xin sát. Okay, Nuno.
I want to know, it's a question about the owners of the newspapers. The question is for Guedes, for the Portuguese newspapers, and also for Agnes, for the Chinese newspapers. Because I think we know the Abelha de China, it was published by the Leal Senado. It means it's by the government. During the 19th century, the evolution of the owners of the newspapers, the government or the private, and if it's the private owners, they have connections with the political connections. The Chinese newspaper maybe with China, and the Portuguese with the different positions of who are against the government or are favor to the government. I want to know about the evolution during the 19th century. Thank you.
Well, about the Chinese press, I don't know. You can.
I think for the Chinese newspaper, if you are talking about the 19th century, it was clear that because we have very few, and so the owner of Agnes was so the first one, Robert Morrison, he actually owned it, and then he originally worked in the East India Company in Macau, and so but then he left the company because the company didn't allow him to publish newspaper or pamphlets, so he left the company. Or he was fired somehow, okay. But then he had his own press and called Elbrin Press. And so he bought a press machine, the printing machine from England, brought to Macau, and published his own, the pamphlets and the newspaper with that machine. So that was called the Robertson Elbrin Press. And so he used that one. So he's the ownership. And then he's the owner. And then for the Agnes belonged to the Portuguese, and then so the Jishinbao that was belonged to so the gang of reformer. Okay, so it really belonged to them. But then at that time they used a name of kind of Macau, Guangzhou businessman. They used his name, not their name. But then the editor was not Lang Qichao. Lang Qichao had a mentor, kind of teacher. Named Kang Youwei, so it's also the reformer. China is very important. His brother was the director or the president of the newspaper. Yeah.
In Portuguese press was a constant from the beginning. There are one newspaper that is published by someone in Macau, but under the orders of the new governor of Macau. The new governor of Macau came to Macau, needs a newspaper to say what he wants to say. In the other side, there are one lawyer, important lawyer, normally connected with the Senado, that have the newspaper of the opposition. So that's why the story of the newspapers in Macau is a 2-year story, more or less, because after 2 years the governor go back to Lisbon, so no newspaper closed. The lawyer connected with Leal Senado also don't need newspaper closed. Come another governor, and the story repeats itself. And this was the story of the press in Macau until the end of the 19th century, when it shows up this Jornal Independent that I spoke, that is from José da Silva, that is also a lawyer. But this, because special circumstances, it lasted for 22 years. What is the record of all newspapers in Macau? Only the Tribuna of Macau surpassed the
And probably Ponto Final in Hoje Macau will surely also surpass that.
Yes.
I'm sure. O Clarim, of course.
O Clarim,
of course.
O Clarim,
of course.
yeah,
O Clarim is the oldest, of course. Of course. Talking about daily newspapers, but of course weekly newspapers important. Anyone else would like to share any remarks, any questions? Yes. Tam Chikung. Please. Thank you.
I'm also a historian
So that's why I guess you were going
of
to
the history
jump
of
in.
Macau's journalism and communication. I may provide there's another very famous newspaper in Chinese and Macau is Ao Bao. It was published by very famous reformers in the 19th century of China. He was called Jiang Gunying, the owner of the Zhen Feminist Mansion.
Mandarin House.
Yeah, Mandarin House. Yeah. He published this newspaper about 2 years, but it's a very a pity that we cannot find only one sheet about this newspaper. We can only find one article which was written by the Dr. Sun Yat-sen, which was called
Reforming agriculture in China.
We find this article is in a 10 days newspaper of the Zhongshan City, which was called Zhongshan Xunkan, Zhongshan City's 10 days newspaper. It's very a pity, because this is the first pure Chinese newspaper who talking about the politics about the China or Macau, but we cannot find any one original paper about that.
So actually, what Gamal just said was maybe you have some hints, and because then we in Sun Yat-sen's kind of autobiography, so he mentioned that he published one article on a newspaper named Obo, so that's one. But then we never find the original copy of the Obo. And then he said he published the article about how to reform agriculture in China. And so we found the article, but we can't find the newspaper. And so and it's always people always try to chase where is that Obo, and then where was it? And so some people even speculate that Obo means Ekumakayensh. Maybe, but I don't think, I don't know, but in Ekumakayensh, I read all the Chinese versions, all the Chinese copies. There were no article about reforming agriculture. So I don't know if there will be any material In Portuguese, they talking about this, yeah.
There are one constant also in the history of the press in Macau, because the government, the authorities never conserve the newspapers of Macau. So we have the Portuguese newspapers that survive is thanks to a man called Angelo, that is a collector of newspapers, and he full an entire house with newspapers. Abelha da China, lots of. And I'm not sure if it was Father Teixeira or someone before him that went to the governor and say, we need to save this history of the press and buy the newspapers to Mr. Angelo, because he have no more space to keep newspapers, and he threatened to fire the newspapers, because he have to go inside his house and have no space. So this is a very big problem. It was saved. See, the Abelha da China, the numbers that are in Macau, the collection is not complete. It was found, the rest of the collection, in a private collection in the north of Portugal, in Ponte de Lima, that is a small village. Is someone that was here in Macau and took the newspapers and went to Ponte de Lima. So it's very difficult to make the story of the press here in Macau.
So newspapers can literally be a highly combustible matter for the mind and for the fire itself, of course. Anyone else would like to jump in? Any questions, any remarks?
Actually, I want to, maybe.
Go ahead. Please.
I was wondering if there was Portuguese press in Hong Kong, right? If there are any archives of that?
Yes. Actually, there was one newspaper. I think in Hong Kong they published at least 10 Portuguese newspapers in Hong Kong. And so there was one, actually they published both in Macau and Hong Kong. That was the one named Joao. And so it was kind of, I think it's a kind of great newspaper. And I think it was the only newspaper that published only news and not really, all those kind of political commentary. So it's basically a commercial newspaper. And so it was published the time when the British they start to live in Hong Kong, and so then they publish a lot of shipping news, which ship is coming with what kind of cargo is, something like that. So that was one, and there were some other also. But I think that when the Portuguese start to publish newspaper in Hong Kong, it might be also the time that if I look at the title of the Portuguese newspaper in Macau, I don't know what happened in Portugal at that time, but then we start to have a lot of names like patriotic, or independent, as the name of the news media at that time. So it might be the time that they were built, the nationalism building was happening, right?
Well, yes, but there are another phenomenon interesting about this is that when the governor, new governor, is harsh and don't allow newspapers, normally the opposition in Macau go to print the newspaper in Hong Kong. So the newspaper is all about Macau, but it's printed in Hong Kong, so the governor cannot do nothing. So that's why there are a few titles in Hong Kong, but the subject is entirely against the governor and about things of Macau.
So as we can see, there's plenty of untapped field in terms of research about the 19th century and the history of the press in Macau, linking it to Hong Kong and across the border, of course. So I'm sure, Agnes, you're thinking about some new research projects.
Yeah, actually, when
You can share
mentioned
them
so-
with us. And,
No,
and
because-
Joao has got a couple of
No,
books
it's not
in
my
the pipeline.
No, but I hope that we need to have more people doing research on that. I think that my Portuguese is too bad, and then so those guys in TDM didn't teach me well enough when I was working there, and so but then I think that it's really rich history about that, because you can do a lot of topics like identity in the newspaper, and then nationalism, and also kind of local identity, the community history. I think is all very important. And actually, when I read the editorial, the first editorial of Abaya de China, and I find it's really kind of fascinating, because it won't be something that we can imagine happening in 19th century. So it was basically really talking about that we mechanists are now standing up in front of the Niao Senado. We want to fight for our own right, something like that. Then can you imagine? And then we won't have this kind of things happening in Macau now, right? And I was like, wow, they were like this. And also, I think that the newspaper was a big example for the Chinese at that time, because then we used to believe that the priests, the missionary, they bought the printing machine here in Macau. But I think that it started from the Portuguese, and then when they start to publish Abaya de China or Noticias, before that, and then so we start to see, Chinese community, they start to see that, actually, newspaper or that kind of format, bulletin press, can come from ordinary people, or you can cover story like that, because at the same time, at that time, why we have very little Chinese newspaper? Because we read the Peking Gazette. Peking Gazette is the newspaper published by the emperor. So we read that one. So that was our newspaper. So the newspaper was about the emperors going somewhere today, to worship the god, something like that. And so what would be the new policy implemented in Canton or in Beijing? And so some prisoner, broke the prison, and then it was things like that. But it was all the emperor or the Beijing Forbidden City was the only source for the news. It's basically like that. So then I think that at that time, when what happened in Macau is kind of the extension of the Portugal politics, it's a party politics happening. I think that I can't really find anyone studying Portuguese newspaper in 19th century in any Chinese text talking about that. But I just imagine at that time when people read newspaper, if they read it, and I thought, wow, what are they doing there, and that is so different. And so I think that might affect a generation of Chinese at that time. Yeah.
Interesting that you point out the issue of how one's identity, one community's identity, one city's identity, the way it portrays itself can be reflected in a newspaper. You're saying that, for instance, in Abelha de China is the first time, of course, you come across this idea of Macaense, we Macanese. Later on, Omunyan, the idea and the concept of Onmunyan, which has not been so much out, like a Wayan, or I'm not saying Huaran, right? But and even being a Macau Chinese or a Macau Portuguese, and all this being reflected in the newspapers in a sort of discourse and narrative of self-identification of a city's interest and a city's autonomy reflected in the newspapers. João, in this respect, how do you, just a final note on the way the interests of Macau and of the different groups in Macau, but of a certain approach to the interests of the Macau people, even if it's the Macau Portuguese or the Macanese, how is it reflected in those newspapers in the 19th century?
Well, I think there are one interesting thing that we cannot evaluate nowadays, because the world have changed completely. At that time, in the second half of the 19th century and until the 30s of the 20th century, Macau is much more near of China than now, because after especially after 49, with the communist China and Salazar in Portugal, the border gate was closed. So it stops the interaction. But the lawyers of Macau can go to the courts in Canton. Yeah, this is very important. It's interesting that Manuel da Silva Mendes, the famous writer, and the most part of his cases, they are in Canton, not in Macau. Yeah, and he is connected with the most important and leading figures of the politics and philosophy of the end of 19th century and beginning of so. After the 30s, Macau changed. Macau became an inner city. People talking itself. No more dialogue with the border gate, and the situation changed completely. The relationship ceased to be personal between Macanese and the Chinese, and become politics and nothing more.
Very interesting point. Anyone would like to throw in the very last question before we wrap up our talk? Maybe, yes. Okay.
Well, it's regarding the word
Thank you.
Mackenzie, Omunyan, that Agnes translated. I'm some doubt because nowadays Mackenzie, when you mention Mackenzie, it is Omun Tousang. People were born of Portuguese ancestry, but born in Macau, and they are a little bit apart from the Portuguese from mainland Portugal. May I say? Yeah. So I don't know whether at that time they made the China. When it's referring to Mackenzie, it is referring to people in Macau, people which are loyal to the loyal Senate. People governing Macau or people from Portugal, they are settled down in Macau. So my doubt is whether that Mackenzie refers to Omunyan or Omun Tosa.
Yeah, good question.
Actually, my understanding would not be enough to really to answer the question, because I only saw that word there and there's they are saying things like that. And I think I need maybe more study to understand, because it's Barbosa wrote that article. I think Barbosa wrote that editorial. So I think it was more or less part of his speech after they heard that the revolution news. He said the old regime was down. It was like that. So I don't understand the context enough to know that if he's referring to only the Tousang, the Eurasian, or all everyone in Macau. But I'm quite sure that it wasn't for the Chinese. It wasn't even okay. So that's the thing. And because that in the Abaya de China, there was one thing very interesting. So they published minutes of the kind of city, you call it some kind of city assembly at that time. So they published at that time. So at that time they call everyone. They call everyone, okay, every single mechanism, please come to Liao's another square, and then let's have a meeting. And so then after the meeting they discuss something, and then they publish the minutes on the newspaper. It was like some kind of community newspaper. So I think that now I don't have enough knowledge to understand. So at that time, would they include, the whole community, or just the Chinese community? But if you're reading some other material talking about the history at that time, I think that they only include the Portuguese and the Macanese. Yeah.
So João, Macaenses filhos da terra, or
well,
not?
I have an opinion about that.
But the way it was received.
Okay, I think we sometimes forget that only in the beginning of Macau the Portuguese settled here without Chinese. It was in the 15th century, 16th century. After that, there was Chinese and Portuguese, and there are intermarriage, and especially. We have to know that in the first, I can say in the 18th century, The main companies of Macau were Portuguese. In 1940 something, the main companies are all Chinese. So there are an important Chinese community here that have to be considered. What happens is that the historians of Macau speak about what? You speak about the governors and the secretaries, and they come from Portugal, so they are Portuguese. But the people that lives here they are Macanese, Chinese and Portuguese, but Macanese. Some of them are Chinese and Portuguese, other are Portuguese or Chinese. But I think this is Omunian is these people, is my opinion. So that restrictive image of the Macanese as a special, I think the Macanese is the Portuguese people that was born here, his fathers were born here, and so on and so on and so on. Chinese the same. Because there are important figures that need to be studied, especially in the second half of 19th century. There are lots of people that contribute greatly to Macau, to the culture of Macau, because the culture of Macau is not a Portuguese, not a Chinese culture. It's a mix of both. And so, in my opinion, I think these generations of Chinese and Portuguese that live here, they are Macanese.
Very well. Camões, one last question. Dr. Camões.
I think I may answer your question partly. Because under the text analyze, if you're using the Macanese or Magestas, there's a newspaper in the 19th century. It probably only means the Filus Terra, only the Portuguese Macau people, not include the Chinese Macau people. Because they, under some research, if they describe all the people of Macau, they will use the Macau Filus or Macau Residentes, not use the Macanese or Magista. But in Chinese, Omunyan is more broader. Omunyan at least includes three kinds. In Chinese, first, Filus Terra. Second, ethical Chinese. Third, and other country foreigners. We cannot think the Macanese is, the meaning of Macanese is equal to the Chinese Omunyan. It's quite different.
Of course. For sure. Well, this is a fascinating topic. Would take us for another hour, but I guess it's about time to wrap up our very pleasant talk. I'd like to thank you very, very much, Agnes Lam and Joao Guedes. A big hand. Thank you all. Muito obrigado, and thank you very much, the Script Road Festival, for everything. Long live Rotas das Letras. Thank you very much. Obrigado, Ricardo. Obrigado, Elber.